"Eleanor, just sign these papers. It's for your long-term care," Richard said, sliding a thick manila envelope across the sterile hospital table where I was supposed to be celebrating my first solid meal in 3 months. His voice was reassuring, but his eyes were cold, calculating. "Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." I glanced down at the document title through still blurry vision. Final Transfer of Property, Riverstone Ranch and Associated Holdings. The private hospital room with its beeping monitors and the congratulatory flowers from my physical therapist suddenly felt like a trap. Richard's brother, Thomas, stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching intently. "Is everything okay?" asked Mariana, my nurse of 6 weeks, who had stepped in to check my vitals. I managed a tight smile despite the hurricane of anger and betrayal building inside me. "Actually, no. My husband has just asked me to sign over our ranch and all our assets while I'm still recovering from a traumatic brain injury." I lifted my shaking hand to press the call button clipped to my hospital gown. "I think we need Captain Reynolds now." At my words, 2 uniformed military police officers stepped into the room from the hallway, followed by a tall woman in a crisp suit. "Mrs. Blackwood, is there a problem?" asked Captain Sarah Reynolds, the JAG officer who had become my lifeline over the past 2 weeks, when the hospital staff had finally allowed me supervised access to my phone. "My name is Eleanor Blackwood, and 4 years ago I was just Staff Sergeant Eleanor Martinez, a combat medic with the 68th Combat Support Hospital, finishing my 3rd deployment in Afghanistan. I had built a reputation as the medic you wanted in a crisis. Steady hands, quick decisions, and a stubborn refusal to give up on anyone who still had a fighting chance. My final mission before rotation home had earned me a Silver Star when our convoy hit an IED, and I had treated 14 wounded soldiers under sporadic enemy fire for 4 hours until evacuation arrived. What started as a military career had evolved into a promising future back home. Using my combat medical experience and GI Bill, I had completed an accelerated nursing program, specializing in trauma care. I had saved almost every penny of my combat pay and deployment bonuses, building a nest egg that would become the down payment on my dream, a 120-acre property in western Montana's Paradise Valley that I planned to turn into a rehabilitation retreat for wounded veterans. That's how I met Richard Blackwood at a fundraising gala in Bozeman, tall with salt and pepper. Hair and a confident smile, Richard had the practiced charm of someone who navigated expensive ballrooms with ease. He approached me after I'd given a short speech about my vision for Riverstone Ranch, eyes bright with what I mistook for shared purpose. "Your passion for helping other veterans is inspiring," he said, extending his hand. "Richard Blackwood, Montana Heritage Properties. I've helped develop several therapeutic riding programs in the state." One business lunch led to another, and soon our professional connection evolved into something more personal. Richard was attentive, knowledgeable about property development, and seemed genuinely supportive of my vision for Riverstone. Better yet, he had connections throughout the state that could help navigate the complex permitting process for establishing a therapeutic facility. 6 months into dating, he invited me to meet his family at their sprawling lakeside home near Whitefish. The warning signs were there from the beginning, though I chose to ignore them. The first dinner with the Blackwoods was an exercise in subtle condescension disguised as concern. "A veteran's retreat?" Victoria Blackwood asked, perfectly manicured fingers adjusting a pearl necklace that probably cost more than my annual VA disability stipend. "How charitable, though I imagine the liability insurance alone would be crippling." Thomas, Richard's younger brother and business partner, had been more direct. "Military folks have their own facilities through the VA, don't they? Seems like an awful lot of work to compete with government services." I explained that the VA was overwhelmed, that waiting lists for therapeutic programs could stretch for months, and that many rural veterans had to travel hundreds of miles for treatments. Riverstone would offer something different, a peaceful place where recovery could happen in nature, away from institutional settings, with programs specifically designed by veterans for veterans. Richard jumped in, his hand squeezing mine under the table. Eleanor's being modest. Her background as both a combat medic and trauma nurse gives her unique insights. Plus, the property she's acquired has remarkable development potential beyond the retreat. I turned to him, confused. We had never discussed development potential, beyond the therapeutic facilities I had planned. Richard smiled at me with a look I would later recognize as warning. Play along. Our relationship progressed rapidly after that. Within 8 months, Richard proposed during a weekend trip to Glacier National Park. The ring was extravagant, a family heirloom that Victoria had insisted he use. I said yes, swept up in what felt like a whirlwind romance and the intoxicating feeling of having a partner who understood both my military past and civilian ambitions. The undermining began subtly after our engagement. Richard started scheduling strategy sessions with me to discuss Riverstone's future. His suggestions increasingly centered around a phased development approach. The veterans' retreat is noble, Ellie, he would say, but we need to ensure it's sustainable. What if we developed the northern parcel with a few luxury cabins? The income could subsidize the therapeutic programs. I held firm to my vision. Riverstone was meant to be a sanctuary, not a commercial venture. The property had natural hot springs, pristine forest, and the kind of mountain quiet that could heal souls shattered by war. I wanted every acre dedicated to recovery. The wedding was elaborate, orchestrated almost entirely by Victoria with minimal input from me. I compromised on almost everything except the guest list, insisting that my battle buddies from the 68th and my fellow nurses from Bozeman Memorial be included. The ceremony took place at the Blackwoods Church, followed by a reception at Montana's most exclusive mountain resort. During the reception, I overheard a conversation between Richard and a developer I didn't recognize. Your wife's property. Beautiful location. Would be perfect for our wilderness estates concept, the man said. Richard nodded confidentially. We're working on a comprehensive plan. Just a matter of timing. When I confronted him later that night in our hotel suite, he dismissed my concerns. It's just business talk, Ellie. People expect certain conversations. Besides, what's wrong with exploring all the possibilities for Riverstone's future? After the wedding, we moved into a beautiful home in Bozeman that Richard had chosen, much closer to his office than to Riverstone Ranch. I continued working shifts at the hospital while developing my plans for the retreat. I had secured several grants specifically for veteran-focused programs, and architectural renderings for the main lodge and therapy facilities were nearly complete. Richard's comments about my dedication to the project became increasingly pointed. Another late night with the plans? I thought marriage might shift your priorities a bit. Then came the accident, unexpected and devastating. I was driving back from Riverstone after meeting with a contractor about breaking ground on the first phase of construction. Montana in February can be treacherous, and a sudden snowstorm reduced visibility on the mountain road to near zero. I didn't see the logging truck that had jackknifed across both lanes until it was too late. The impact was catastrophic. My SUV crumpled like paper, and I was airlifted to Bozeman Memorial, the same hospital where I worked as a trauma nurse. The injuries were extensive: collapsed lung, shattered femur, ruptured spleen, and the most serious of all, a traumatic brain injury that sent me into a coma. For 7 weeks, I existed in darkness. Doctors later told me that my family and friends maintained a constant vigil at my bedside. My battle buddies flew in from across the country. My parents relocated, temporarily from Arizona to be near me. And Richard, by all accounts, was the devoted husband, managing medical decisions, coordinating with specialists, and keeping everyone updated on my condition. What no one knew, what no one could have known, was what Richard was doing when he wasn't at the hospital. My first memories after the coma are fragmented, like trying to assemble a jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing. Beeping machines, the antiseptic smell of hospital disinfectant, the cool touch of a pen light checking my pupil response, and voices, so many voices, talking about me rather than to me. Remarkable recovery. Still significant neurological deficits. Long-term cognitive function remains uncertain. Power of attorney remains in effect until competency is established. That last fragment should have alarmed me, but in those early days, I was too focused on the monumental task of relearning basic functions. How to swallow. How to form words. How to move limbs that felt disconnected from my consciousness. Richard was there frequently, always when doctors were present, always appearing supportive and concerned. "Don't worry about anything but getting better," he would say, patting my hand. "I'm taking care of everything else." 3 weeks after waking from the coma, still struggling with speech and processing, I asked about Riverstone. Richard's expression flickered briefly before settling into practiced concern. "We've had to pause the project while you recover," he explained. "The medical bills are substantial, even with your military insurance." Something about his answer felt wrong, but my injured brain couldn't process exactly what. I tried again the next day, asking specifically about the grant money that had been dedicated to the first phase of construction. "All the finances are being managed, Ellie," he said, a hint of impatience creeping into his voice. "The important thing is focusing on your recovery. We can talk business when you're stronger." As the fog in my mind gradually cleared, I began noticing patterns. Richard always deflected questions about Riverstone or our finances. He became frustrated when I asked to see my phone or laptop. He scheduled his visits during doctor rounds, ensuring our conversations were limited and supervised. And most tellingly, he always had a reason why my close friends from the military couldn't visit, citing doctor's orders about limiting stimulation, despite the medical team encouraging social interaction as part of my cognitive recovery. The turning point came 6 weeks into my post-coma recovery. Mariana, my day shift nurse, had become something of an ally. Unlike the rotating cast of medical staff, she seemed to notice the subtle tension during Richard's visits and the way I struggled to articulate concerns I couldn't fully formulate. One afternoon, after Richard had left following another deflected conversation about Riverstone, Mariana closed the door to my room and pulled a chair close to my bed. "Eleanor," she said quietly, "something doesn't feel right with your husband." The direct statement cut through my mental haze. I nodded slowly, relieved that someone else saw it too. "He's hiding." "Something," I managed, my speech still halting from the brain injury. Mariana hesitated before continuing. "Yesterday, I overheard him on the phone in the hallway. He was discussing property parcels and development permits. Something about closing before she's discharged." My heart rate accelerated, setting off one of the monitors. "My ranch," I said, the words feeling thick in my mouth. "He's selling my ranch." "Do you have someone you trust completely?" Mariana asked. "Someone not connected to your husband?" The face that came to mind was unexpected. Not family or a close friend, but Captain Reynolds, a JAG officer I'd crossed paths with during my final deployment. We had stayed loosely in touch, and I knew she had recently been stationed at the Montana National Guard headquarters in Helena, less than 2 hours away. With trembling hands, I wrote down her name and what I could remember of her contact information. Mariana promised to try reaching her discreetly. 2 days later, when Richard was scheduled to be in Whitefish for a family emergency, Mariana smuggled in my phone, retrieved from the hospital security office where personal effects were stored. After my accident, the screen was cracked from the impact, but it still functioned. More importantly, it contained a record of communications I had no memory of, spanning the 7 weeks of my coma and early recovery. What I found made my blood run cold. Dozens of emails between Richard and Thomas outlining a comprehensive plan to leverage my medical situation, conversations with developers about parceling Riverstone for a luxury wilderness community, communications with the banks holding my accounts and property deeds, and most damning of all, documentation of a power of attorney I had apparently signed, giving Richard complete control over all my assets and medical decisions, a document dated 3 days after my accident, when I had been deeply unconscious. The signature on the power of attorney looked nothing like mine. With Mariana's help, I managed to send a message to Captain Reynolds, including photos of the suspicious power of attorney and a brief explanation of my situation. By some miracle, Sarah responded within hours. Her message was concise and reassuring. "Stay calm. Document everything. I'm coming tomorrow with help." That night was the longest of my life, longer even than waiting for medevac under enemy fire in Afghanistan. I lay awake, my mind clearer than it had been since the accident, cataloging every inconsistency, every deflection, every subtle manipulation from the man I had married. The man who was systematically stealing everything I had worked for while I fought to recover from injuries that had nearly killed me. Captain Reynolds arrived the next morning with a paralegal and a digital forensics specialist. Under the guise of a VA benefits consultation, they gained access to my room during a time when Richard was known to be in meetings. Sarah's efficiency was exactly what I remembered from Afghanistan: precise, thorough, and leaving nothing to chance. "The power of attorney is almost certainly fraudulent," she confirmed after examining the document. "The notary stamp belongs to a person who died 3 months before your accident. Sloppy work, frankly." The forensics specialist was already downloading evidence from my phone and the laptop Sarah had brought, preserving the digital trail of Richard's activities. The paralegal was taking my statement, recording my clear assertion that I had never authorized any sales or transfers of my property. "Here's where we stand legally," Sarah explained, her directness a welcome change from the careful tiptoeing of most visitors. "With the power of attorney being fraudulent, any transactions he's initiated using it are voidable. But we need to act quickly. Some deals may already be in progress." Together, we developed a plan. First, Sarah would file emergency injunctions, preventing any property transfers related to Riverstone Ranch or my other assets. Second, the forensics team would continue gathering evidence of financial misconduct and forgery. Finally, I would continue to appear relatively compliant, while gradually asserting my improving cognitive function with my medical team, building a record of my competence. "The hardest part," Sarah warned, "will be maintaining the facade with Richard until everything is in place. He can't know we're onto him until we've secured the legal protections." For the next 2 weeks, I engaged in the most challenging performance of my life, appearing less recovered than I actually was when Richard was present, while working intensively with my therapists when he wasn't. I allowed him to believe I was still easily confused about financial matters, while secretly working with Sarah to document every aspect of his scheme. We discovered that Richard had already sold 2 parcels of Riverstone, the pristine northern section with the natural hot springs, and the eastern meadow where I had planned to build an equine therapy facility. The proceeds had been diverted to accounts I had no access to. He had also withdrawn substantial amounts from my savings, the money intended for constructing the veterans' retreat, citing medical expenses that were actually covered by my military insurance. Most disturbingly, we uncovered communications, indicating that Richard had begun this planning before our wedding, specifically targeting my property and savings from the beginning. The ranch I had purchased independently, the dream I had funded with my combat pay and VA benefits, had always been his true objective. With Sarah's help, I connected with my old battle buddies, including James Corrado, a former ranger who now ran a private security firm with several other veterans. They agreed to provide protection once I was released from the hospital, anticipating that Richard might not react well to discovering his plans had been exposed. When my doctors finally cleared me for discharge, Richard immediately pushed to Have me transferred to a costly long-term care facility in another state, claiming our home wasn't suitable for my continued recovery. I recognized this for what it was, an attempt to isolate me further from potential allies in Montana. The day before my scheduled discharge became the moment of truth. Richard arrived with the thick manila envelope containing what he described as routine paperwork for my transfer and ongoing care. In reality, they were documents transferring all remaining interest in Riverstone Ranch and my other assets to a trust controlled exclusively by him. "Eleanor, just sign these papers. It's for your long-term care," he said, sliding the envelope across the table, his voice reassuring but his eyes cold and calculating. I glanced down at the document title, Final Transfer of Property, Riverstone Ranch and Associated Holdings. The private hospital room suddenly felt like a trap. Richard's brother Thomas stood in the doorway, watching intently. "Is everything okay?" asked Mariana, stepping in to check my vitals with perfect timing. "Exactly as we had arranged," I managed, a tight smile despite the hurricane of anger building inside me. "Actually, no. My husband has just asked me to sign over our ranch and all our assets while I'm still recovering from a traumatic brain injury." I pressed the call button clipped to my hospital gown. "I think we need Captain Reynolds now." At my signal, 2 military police officers stepped into the room, followed by Sarah in her formal JAG uniform. "Mrs. Blackwood, is there a problem?" she asked, though she knew exactly what was happening. Richard's face contorted with shock and rage. "What is this? Who authorized military personnel in my wife's room?" "I did," I said, my voice stronger than it had been in months. "After discovering you forged my signature on a power of attorney while I was in a coma." Thomas moved away from the doorway, suddenly looking for an exit as Sarah continued. "Mr. Blackwood, we have documented evidence of multiple felonies, including forgery, fraud, exploitation of an incapacitated person, and attempted theft of property exceeding $5 million in value." Richard's composure shattered completely. "This is ridiculous. Eleanor is confused. Her brain injury has affected her judgment. I'm her husband, for God's sake. Everything I've done has been to protect our interests." "Our interests?" I repeated, the months of fear and confusion crystallizing into cold fury. "You mean your interests. I've seen the emails, Richard. I know you targeted my property before. We even married. I know about the deals with Wilderness Estates. I know everything." What followed was a carefully orchestrated legal intervention. The military police detained Richard pending arrival of county authorities. Sarah presented the emergency injunctions already filed with the courts, preventing any further transactions related to my assets. Thomas, recognizing the magnitude of evidence against them, attempted to distance himself, claiming he had only been following Richard's lead. By evening, Richard had been taken into custody on initial charges of fraud and financial exploitation. The hospital room that had felt like a prison for months suddenly became a command center as Sarah and her team continued documenting evidence and coordinating with local prosecutors. James and 2 other veterans from my former unit arrived to provide security, their presence a physical reminder that I was no longer isolated and vulnerable. For the first time since waking from the coma, I felt something close to safe. That night, as I prepared for discharge the following day, I sat by the window of my hospital room, looking out at the mountains silhouetted against the darkening sky. The same mountains that cradled Riverstone Ranch, the dream that Richard had nearly stolen, but which now might still be salvaged. Sarah entered quietly, setting a cup of decent coffee, smuggled past hospital regulations, on the table beside. "Me?" "The initial forensic accounting is complete," she reported. "It's bad, but not as bad as it could have been. The 2 parcels he sold can potentially be recovered through legal action, since they were sold under fraudulent authority. The funds he diverted have been largely traced and frozen." I nodded, processing this information with a clarity that had been absent for months. "And Richard?" "Denied bail, Sarah said with grim satisfaction. The judge was particularly unimpressed by the exploitation of a decorated combat veteran during a medical crisis. The prosecutor is already talking about additional charges as more evidence comes to light. Thank you, I said, the words entirely inadequate for what she had done. I would have lost everything. Sarah's expression softened slightly. In Afghanistan, you ran into active fire to drag out 3 wounded soldiers. You saved my captain when everyone else said he was too far gone. This was just returning the favor. As she left, I turned back to the window, watching as the first stars appeared above the mountains. Tomorrow I would leave this hospital, not for some distant care facility chosen by Richard, but for a safe house arranged by James and my military family. From there, the road to recovery, both physical and financial, would be long and challenging. But I had survived worse. I had survived a war zone. I had survived a near-fatal accident and a coma. I had survived a husband who saw me not as a partner, but as a target to be exploited at my most vulnerable. I thought about Riverstone Ranch, about the veterans who would eventually find healing there, just as I had envisioned. Richard had nearly destroyed that dream during the darkness of my coma. But now, awake and aware, I would rebuild what he had tried to take, stronger, wiser, and with allies I could truly trust. The monitor tracking my vitals showed a strong, steady heartbeat. Like me, damaged but resilient. Like the dream that refused to die, even when everything conspired against it. Dozens of emails between Richard and Thomas outlined a comprehensive plan to leverage my medical situation. Communications with developers about parceling Riverstone for a luxury wilderness community. Negotiations with the banks holding my accounts and property deeds. And most damning of all, documentation of a power of attorney I had apparently signed, giving Richard complete control over all my assets and medical decisions, a document dated 3 days after my accident, when I had been deeply unconscious. The signature on the power of attorney looked nothing like mine. With Mariana's help, I managed to send a message to Captain Reynolds, including photos of the suspicious power of attorney and a brief explanation of my situation. By some miracle, Sarah responded within hours. Her message was concise and reassuring. Stay calm. Document everything. I'm coming tomorrow with help. That night was the longest of my life, longer even than waiting for medevac under enemy fire in Afghanistan. I lay awake, my mind clearer than it had been since the accident, cataloging every inconsistency, every deflection, every subtle manipulation from the man I had married. The man who was systematically stealing everything I had worked for while I fought to recover from injuries that had nearly killed me. Captain Reynolds arrived the next morning with a paralegal and a digital forensics specialist. Under the guise of a VA benefits consultation, they gained access to my room during a time when Richard was known to be in meetings. Sarah's efficiency was exactly what I remembered from Afghanistan, precise, thorough, and leaving nothing to chance. The power of attorney is almost certainly fraudulent, she confirmed after examining the document. The notary stamp belongs to a person who died 3 months before your accident. Sloppy work, frankly. The forensics specialist was already downloading evidence from my phone and the laptop Sarah had brought, preserving the digital trail of Richard's activities. The paralegal was taking my statement, recording my clear assertion that I had never authorized any sales or transfers of my property. Here's where we stand legally, Sarah explained, her directness a welcome change from the careful tiptoeing of most visitors. With the power of attorney being fraudulent, any transactions he's initiated using it are voidable. But we need to act quickly. Some deals may already be in progress. Together, we developed a plan. First, Sarah would file emergency injunctions, preventing any property transfers related to Riverstone Ranch or my other assets. Second, the forensics team would continue gathering evidence of financial misconduct and forgery. Finally, I would continue to appear relatively compliant, while gradually asserting my improving cognitive function with my medical team, building a record of my competence. The hardest part, Sarah warned. We'll be maintaining the facade with Richard until everything is in place. He can't know we're onto him until we've secured the legal protections. For the next 2 weeks, I engaged in the most challenging performance of my life, appearing less recovered than I actually was when Richard was present, while working intensively with my therapists when he wasn't. I allowed him to believe I was still easily confused about financial matters while secretly working with Sarah to document every aspect of his scheme. We discovered that Richard had already sold 2 parcels of Riverstone, the pristine northern section with the natural hot springs, and the eastern meadow where I had planned to build an equine therapy facility. The proceeds had been diverted to accounts I had no access to. He had also withdrawn substantial amounts from my savings, the money intended for constructing the veterans' retreat, citing medical expenses that were actually covered by my military insurance. Most disturbingly, we uncovered communications, indicating that Richard had begun this planning before our wedding, specifically targeting my property and savings from the beginning. The ranch I had purchased independently, the dream I had funded with my combat pay and VA benefits, had always been his true objective. With Sarah's help, I connected with my old battle buddies, including James Corrado, a former ranger who now ran a private security firm with several other veterans. They agreed to provide protection once I was released from the hospital, anticipating that Richard might not react well to discovering his plans had been exposed. When my doctors finally cleared me for discharge, Richard immediately pushed to have me transferred to a costly long-term care facility in another state, claiming our home wasn't suitable for my continued recovery. I recognized this for what it was, an attempt to isolate me further from potential allies in Montana. The day before my scheduled discharge became the moment of truth. Richard arrived with the thick manila envelope containing what he described as routine paperwork for my transfer and ongoing care. In reality, they were documents transferring all remaining interest in Riverstone Ranch and my other assets to a trust controlled exclusively by him. Eleanor, just sign these papers. It's for your long-term care, he said, sliding the envelope across the table, his voice reassuring but his eyes cold and calculating. I glanced down at the document title, Final Transfer of Property, Riverstone Ranch and Associated Holdings. The private hospital room suddenly felt like a trap. Richard's brother Thomas stood in the doorway, watching intently. Is everything okay? Asked Mariana, stepping in to check my vitals with perfect timing, exactly as we had arranged. I managed a tight smile despite the hurricane of anger building inside me. Actually, no. My husband has just asked me to sign over our ranch and all. Our assets while I'm still recovering from a traumatic brain injury. I pressed the call button clipped to my hospital gown. I think we need Captain Reynolds now. At my signal, 2 military police officers stepped into the room, followed by Sarah in her formal JAG uniform. Mrs. Blackwood, is there a problem? She asked, though she knew exactly what was happening. Richard's face contorted with shock and rage. What is this? Who authorized military personnel in my wife's room? I did, I said, my voice stronger than it had been in months. After discovering you forged my signature on a power of attorney while I was in a coma. Thomas moved away from the doorway, suddenly looking for an exit as Sarah continued. Mr. Blackwood, we have documented evidence of multiple felonies, including forgery, fraud, exploitation of an incapacitated person, and attempted theft of property exceeding $5 million in value. Richard's composure shattered completely. This is ridiculous. Eleanor is confused. Her brain injury has affected her judgment. I'm her husband, for God's sake. Everything I've done has been to protect our interests. Our interests? I repeated, the months of fear and confusion crystallizing into cold fury. You mean your interests. I've seen the emails, Richard. I know you targeted my property before. We even married. I know about the deals with Wilderness Estates. I know everything. What followed was a carefully orchestrated legal intervention. The military police detained Richard pending arrival of county authorities. Sarah presented the emergency injunctions already filed with the courts, preventing any further transactions related to my assets. Thomas, recognizing the magnitude of evidence against them, attempted to distance himself, claiming he had only been following Richard's lead. By evening, Richard had been taken into custody on initial charges of fraud and financial exploitation. The hospital room that had felt like a prison for months suddenly became a command center as Sarah and her team continued documenting evidence and coordinating with local prosecutors. James and 2 other veterans from my former unit arrived to provide security, their presence a physical reminder that I was no longer isolated and vulnerable. For the first time since waking from the coma, I felt something close to safe. That night, as I prepared for discharge the following day, I sat by the window of my hospital room, looking out at the mountains silhouetted against the darkening sky. The same mountains that cradled Riverstone Ranch, the dream that Richard had nearly stolen, but which now might still be salvaged. Sarah entered quietly, setting a cup of decent coffee, smuggled past hospital regulations, on the table beside me. "The initial forensic accounting is complete," she reported. "It's bad, but not as bad as it could have been. The 2 parcels he sold can potentially be recovered through legal action, since they were sold under fraudulent authority. The funds he diverted have been largely traced and frozen." I nodded, processing this information with a clarity that had been absent for months. "And Richard?" "Denied bail," Sarah said with grim satisfaction. The judge was particularly unimpressed by the exploitation of a decorated combat veteran during a medical crisis. "The prosecutor is already talking about additional charges as more evidence comes to light." "Thank you," I said, the words entirely inadequate for what she had done. "I would have lost everything." Sarah's expression softened slightly. "In Afghanistan? You ran into active fire to drag out 3 wounded soldiers. You saved my captain when everyone else said he was too far gone. This was just returning the favor." As she left, I turned back to the window, watching as the first stars appeared above the mountains. Tomorrow I would leave this hospital, not for some distant care facility chosen by Richard, but for a safe house arranged by James and my military family. From there, the road to recovery, both physical and financial, would be long and challenging, but I had survived worse. I had survived a war zone. I had survived a near-fatal accident and a coma. I had survived a husband who saw me not as a partner, but as a target to be exploited at my most vulnerable. I thought about Riverstone Ranch, about the veterans who would eventually find healing there, just as I had envisioned. Richard had nearly destroyed that dream during the darkness of my coma. But now, awake and aware, I would rebuild what he had tried to take. Stronger, wiser, and with allies I could truly trust. The monitor tracking my vitals showed a strong, steady heartbeat. Like me, damaged but resilient. Like the dream that refused to die, even when everything conspired against it. The next morning brought the first taste of freedom after months of confinement. Discharge from the hospital should have been a joyous occasion, but the circumstances made it tense and complicated. James and his security team, all veterans I'd served with, escorted me through back hallways and service elevators to avoid any potential confrontation with Richard's family or associates. My possessions had been whittled down to a single duffel bag of clothing and personal items. Everything else remained at the house I had shared with Richard, a house that I now understood had never truly been mine, despite my name on the mortgage. Even my wedding ring had been removed during surgery after the accident and never returned to my finger. I felt its absence as a relief rather than a loss. "Transportation secure," James reported as we reached the parking garage. The former ranger's tactical awareness had translated seamlessly to civilian protection. "Vehicle has been swept, route established with alternates in place." Sarah walked beside my wheelchair, official documents clutched in a leather portfolio. "Judge Rosenberg signed the final emergency orders this morning. Richard's access to all your accounts and properties has been officially terminated, and a comprehensive audit has been authorized. The legal machinery was moving with surprising efficiency, driven by the egregious nature of the fraud and Sarah's relentless advocacy. In just 3 weeks since discovering Richard's scheme, we had managed to halt most of his operations and begin the process of recovering what had been taken. But the toll was evident. Despite my determination, my body was still healing from catastrophic injuries. The TBI made processing complex information exhausting, and my right leg, rebuilt with titanium rods where the femur had shattered, throbbed constantly. The doctors had warned that full recovery could take a year or more, time during which I would remain vulnerable. We arrived at a nondescript SUV with tinted windows. James helped me from the wheelchair into the passenger seat, my movements stiff and pained despite weeks of physical therapy. "Where are we going?" I asked, realizing I had never been told the specific location of the safe house. "Helena," James replied as we pulled away from the hospital. Sarah set us up with a property owned by another JAG officer currently deployed overseas. Secure perimeter, limited access points, and close enough to the military facilities for additional support if needed. I nodded, watching the familiar streets of Bozeman slip past. The city I had come to call home now felt alien and threatening. Somewhere out there, Victoria Blackwood was undoubtedly rallying the family's considerable resources to support Richard and salvage their reputation. Thinking of her reminded me of my own family. "My parents?" I asked, suddenly aware that I hadn't seen them since before discovering Richard's betrayal. Sarah glanced up from her phone. "They're already at the safe house. We thought it best to move them as well, given the circumstances. Richard's family has connections in Arizona." The implication was clear. The Blackwoods' reach extended beyond Montana, and anyone connected to me might be pressured or manipulated. The scale of what I was up against began to sink in. This wasn't just about recovering property or funds. It was about protecting everyone I cared about from a family with generational wealth and influence. The drive to Helena took just under 2 hours, winding through mountain passes still dusted with late spring snow. I dozed intermittently, the combination of medication and constant exhaustion making it impossable to stay fully alert. When I woke as we pulled into a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Helena, the sun was lower in the sky, casting long shadows across unfamiliar terrain. The safe house was a modest rancher set back from the road, surrounded by mature pine, trees that provided both beauty and strategic cover. James completed a perimeter check before escorting me inside, where the emotional reunion with my parents momentarily overwhelmed all other concerns. My father, a retired Army Sergeant Major, who had inspired my own military service, embraced me with careful gentleness. My mother, who had never fully approved of my whirlwind romance with Richard, held back tears as she fussed over my obvious weight loss and pallor. Neither said, "I told you so," though they had expressed reservations about the speed of my relationship. "With Richard from the beginning, we've been so worried," my mother said, helping me settle into an armchair designed to support my still healing body. When Captain Reynolds explained what was happening, she trailed off, unable to find words adequate for the situation. My father stepped in with his typical pragmatism. "You focus on healing, Ellie. Let the lawyers and MPs handle the rest." He squeezed my shoulder gently. "Your squad is here now." That first evening in the safe house established what would become our new normal. Sarah arrived with stacks of legal documents requiring my review and signature, formal complaints, affidavits, motions for recovery of assets. The JAG officer had expanded her original assistance into full legal representation, coordinating with civilian prosecutors and financial fraud specialists. Richard's facing multiple federal charges in addition to state prosecution, she explained as I struggled through the complex legal language, my brain still inconsistently processing information. The evidence of premeditation is particularly damning. We've found communications going back to before your wedding where he discusses with Thomas how to access the Riverstone property once he's secured the relationship. The clinical description of my marriage as a strategic acquisition should have hurt more, but I was beyond that now. Any lingering emotional attachment to Richard had been excised along with the illusions about who he really was. What about the parcels he already sold? I asked, focusing on what mattered most, recovering enough of Riverstone to still realize my vision for a veterans retreat. Sarah spread out a property survey on the coffee table. The northern parcel with the hot springs and the eastern meadow, she indicated, highlighting the sections in question. Sold to shell companies that trace back to wilderness estates. We've already filed to void the transactions based on the fraudulent power of attorney, but recovery could take months of litigation. And the main lodge area? I asked, pointing to the central portion of the property where construction had been scheduled to begin before my accident. Still intact and legally yours, Sarah confirmed. Richard was moving methodically, liquidating the outlying parcels first while setting up the transfer of the main property. Your accident accelerated his timeline, but also created complications. For him. Hence, the forged power of attorney. I studied the map, memories of my plans for Riverstone flooding back. The lodge with communal spaces designed for both privacy and community. The adaptive sports facilities that would accommodate various physical disabilities. The meditation trails through the pine forest. The dream wasn't entirely lost, just deferred and complicated. I need to see it, I said suddenly. Riverstone. I need to go there and assess what's left. James, who had been quietly monitoring security from near the window, shook his head. Not yet, Ellie. Too exposed. We don't know who's watching the property or what kind of surveillance Richard might have established. It's my land, I insisted, frustration rising. After months of hospitalization and now effective house arrest, I craved the open spaces of my property, the tangible reminder of what I was fighting for. And we're going to keep it that way by ensuring your safety, James countered firmly. Give us time to conduct proper reconnaissance and secure the route. A week, maybe 2. The drive to Helena took just under 2 hours, winding through mountain. Passes still dusted with late spring snow. I dozed intermittently, the combination of medication and constant exhaustion making it impossible to stay fully alert. When I woke as we pulled into a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Helena, the sun was lower in the sky, casting long shadows across unfamiliar terrain. The safe house was a modest rancher set back from the road, surrounded by mature pine, trees that provided both beauty and strategic cover. James completed a perimeter check before escorting me inside, where the emotional reunion with my parents momentarily overwhelmed all other concerns. My father, a retired Army sergeant major, who had inspired my own military service, embraced me with careful gentleness. My mother, who had never fully approved of my whirlwind romance with Richard, held back tears as she fussed over my obvious weight loss and pallor. Neither said, "I told you so," though they had expressed reservations about the speed of my relationship with Richard from the beginning. "We've been so worried," my mother said, helping me settle into an armchair designed to support my still healing body. When Captain Reynolds explained what was happening, she trailed off, unable to find words adequate for the situation. My father stepped in with his typical pragmatism. "You focus on healing, Ellie. Let the lawyers and MPs handle the rest." He squeezed my shoulder gently. "Your squad is here now." That first evening in the safe house established what would become our new normal. Sarah arrived with stacks of legal documents requiring my review and signature, formal complaints, affidavits, motions for recovery of assets. The JAG officer had expanded her original assistance into full legal representation, coordinating, with civilian prosecutors and financial fraud specialists. Richard's facing multiple federal charges in addition to state prosecution, she explained as I struggled through the complex legal language, my brain still inconsistently processing information. The evidence of premeditation is particularly damning. We've found communications going back to before your wedding where he discusses with Thomas how to access the Riverstone property once he's secured the relationship. The clinical description of my marriage as a strategic acquisition should have hurt more, but I was beyond that now. Any lingering emotional attachment to Richard had been excised along with the illusions about who he really was. What about the parcels he already sold? I asked, focusing on what mattered most. Recovering enough of Riverstone to still realize my vision for a veterans retreat. Sarah spread out a property survey on the coffee table. The northern parcel with the hot springs and the eastern meadow, she indicated, highlighting the sections in question. Sold to shell companies that trace back to wilderness estates. We've already filed to void the transactions based on the fraudulent power of attorney, but recovery could take months of litigation. And the main lodge area? I asked, pointing to the central portion of the property where construction had been scheduled to begin before my accident. Still intact and legally yours, Sarah confirmed. Richard was moving methodically, liquidating the outlying parcels first while setting up the transfer of the main property. Your accident accelerated his timeline, but also created complications. For him. Hence, the forged power of attorney. I studied the map, memories of my plans for Riverstone flooding back. The lodge with communal spaces designed for both privacy and community. The adaptive sports facilities that would accommodate various physical disabilities. The meditation trails through the pine forest. The dream wasn't entirely lost, just deferred and complicated. I need to see it, I said suddenly. Riverstone. I need to go there and assess what's left. James, who had been quietly monitoring security from near the window, shook his head. Not yet, Ellie. Too exposed. We don't know who's watching the property or what kind of surveillance Richard might have established. It's my land, I insisted, frustration rising. After months of hospitalization and now effective house arrest, I craved the open spaces of my property, the tangible reminder of what I was fighting for. And we're going to keep it that way by ensuring your safety, James countered firmly. Give us time to conduct proper reconnaissance and secure the route. A week, maybe 2. I wanted to argue further, but exhaustion swept over me like a physical weight. Even this brief period of focused concentration had drained what little energy I had. My father noticed immediately, exchanging glances with James. Time for rest, he said, in the tone that had commanded soldiers for decades. Tomorrow's soon enough for more planning. The next days fell into a structured routine that balanced recovery with legal strategy. Mornings were dedicated to physical therapy with a VA specialist who came to the safe house. Afternoons involved cognitive exercises and limited work with Sarah on the legal proceedings. Evenings were for rest and the quiet company of my parents and the rotating security team, most of whom were veterans I'd served with or treated. A week after arriving at the safe house, news broke publicly about Richard's arrest. Sarah brought printouts of newspaper articles and online coverage. Property developer charged with defrauding injured veteran, read the Helena Independent's headline. The article detailed the basic allegations against Richard, emphasizing my military service and Silver Star, and noting the apparent attempt to exploit a decorated combat medic during her recovery from life-threatening injuries. The Blackwoods are trying to control the narrative, Sarah explained, showing me a statement from their attorney claiming Richard had been acting in his wife's best interest during her diminished capacity, and that all financial decisions had been made with the goal of protecting assets during her uncertain prognosis. They're painting you as incompetent and him as the devoted husband, she continued, her disgust evident. But it's not working. The community response has been overwhelmingly supportive of you, especially among veterans groups. Indeed, the Safe House had begun receiving cards, letters, and care packages from veterans organizations across Montana and neighboring states. Word had spread through the tight-knit military community, and the outpouring of support was both heartening and strategically valuable. Public opinion might not determine legal outcomes directly, but it could influence everything from jury selection to settlement negotiations. 2 weeks after my hospital discharge, James finally agreed that a visit to Riverstone could be arranged. His team had conducted thorough reconnaissance, establishing security protocols and checking for surveillance. The property appeared to be monitored only by standard security cameras that could be temporarily disabled. We go at dawn. Minimal personnel, 2 hours maximum on site, he outlined with military precision. Full security escort, medical support on standby, and immediate extraction capability if needed. The prospect of seeing Riverstone again filled me with both anticipation and dread. What would remain of my dream? How much damage had Richard done beyond the parcels he'd sold? Would I still feel the connection to the land that had inspired me from the first moment I'd set foot on it? We departed at first light, a small convoy of unmarked vehicles taking circuitous routes to avoid potential surveillance. I watched the landscape transform from Helena's urban outskirts to the pristine wilderness of Paradise Valley, the jagged peaks of the Absaroka Range emerging in the distance. The journey took longer than necessary due to security precautions, but I didn't mind. Each mile brought me closer to reclaiming a piece of myself. Riverstone Ranch occupied a stunning location where foothills met valley, with a clear creek running through the property and views of snow-capped mountains in nearly every direction. We approached from a rarely used service road, avoiding the main entrance where curious onlookers or Blackwood associates might be watching. James helped me from the vehicle, supporting me as I took my first tentative steps on the property I legally owned but hadn't seen since before the accident. I leaned heavily on my cane, my rebuilt leg protesting the uneven ground, but I barely noticed the pain. For several minutes, I simply stood absorbing the sensory experience, the scent of pine and wildflowers, the sound of water over rocks in the creek, the cool mountain air filling lungs that had grown accustomed to sterile hospital environments. Despite everything, despite the betrayal and the battles still to come, Riverstone remained as I remembered, a place of healing. "Let's see the main site," I said finally, nodding toward where the lodge foundation had been staked out before my accident. James and another security team member flanked me as we made our way slowly across the property. My physical limitations were frustrating, but being here, connecting physically with what I was fighting for, made the struggle worthwhile. The central portion of the property showed signs of abandonment, survey stakes fallen or removed, equipment gone, the cleared area beginning to regrow with native grasses and wildflowers. Nature was already reclaiming what had been briefly disturbed by human plans. "Construction never started," James observed, scanning the area professionally. "No." I agreed, feeling oddly relieved. Better no progress than progress under false pretenses. This way, I could truly begin fresh. We continued our inspection, avoiding the sold parcels while documenting the current state of what remained legally mine. James's team took photographs and notes, creating a record that could be useful in the ongoing legal proceedings. Near the original homestead cabin that had come with the property, a simple structure I'd planned to preserve as a meditation space, I found unexpected evidence of activity. The door showed signs of recent use, though it was currently secured with a heavy padlock I didn't recognize. "Someone's been here," I said, pointing out the trampled vegetation around the entrance. James immediately went on alert, signaling his team to secure the perimeter while he examined the cabin more closely. "Lock's new," he confirmed, inspecting it without touching. "And there's a wireless camera mounted under the eave, well hidden." My heart sank. Even here, in this remote corner of my property, Richard's presence lingered. The violation felt intensely personal, as if he'd continued to invade my most private spaces even after being exposed and arrested. "Can we get inside?" I asked, needing to see what might have been disturbed or taken. James shook his head. "Not without proper equipment and evidence protocols. If there's anything incriminating inside, we don't want to compromise it." He was already on his satellite phone, contacting Sarah to arrange for proper law enforcement documentation. As we waited for the county sheriff's deputy Sarah had summoned, I made my way to the creek that formed the property's eastern boundary. This had been one of my favorite spots, where I'd envisioned wounded warriors finding peace in the rhythmic sounds of flowing water and the beauty of untouched nature. I eased myself down on a large rock overlooking a small cascade, the physical effort worth the moment of connection with the land. One of James's team remained within sight, but gave me space for private reflection. The magnitude of what had happened, and what might still have happened if Mariana hadn't noticed Richard's suspicious behavior, washed over me in waves. I had nearly lost not just Riverstone, but my entire future, my independence, perhaps even my life if Richard's plan had required my continued incapacitation. Yet sitting here, feeling the solid presence of Montana beneath me and the vast sky above, I found an unexpected sense of peace. Richard had taken much: time, money, trust, but he hadn't taken this connection to the land or my vision for its purpose. Those remained intact, waiting to be rebuilt. The deputy arrived within the hour, a no-nonsense woman who documented the cabin's condition and took custody of the surveillance equipment James's team had identified. The lock was removed in our presence, revealing that the cabin had indeed been used recently, likely as a monitoring station for the property. Inside were communication equipment, additional surveillance gear, and most disturbingly, detailed maps of Riverstone with development plans far beyond what Richard had ever discussed with me. "Wilderness Estates Premier Phase," read the header on architectural renderings showing luxury homes scattered across what should have been therapeutic gardens and rehabilitation facilities. "This is evidence of intent," the deputy noted, carefully, photographing and collecting the documents. "Shows he was planning comprehensive development regardless of your wishes." I studied the renderings with growing anger. Every aspect of my vision had been erased, replaced with profit-generating vacation properties for the wealthy. Not a single element acknowledged the property's intended purpose of healing those who had sacrificed for their country. "He never intended to honor my plans," I said, the final illusion about my marriage dissolving. "Not even partially." James nodded grimly. "Looks like he was playing a long game. Marry you, gain control incrementally, then transform the property completely once you were no longer an obstacle. The accident just accelerated his timeline," I concluded, the pieces fitting together with terrible clarity. As we prepared to leave Riverstone, I took a final moment alone near the creek, committing the sensory experience to memory. This visit had been difficult but necessary, providing both evidence for the legal battles ahead and renewed conviction about why those battles mattered. I wasn't just fighting for property or money. I was fighting for a promise made to fellow veterans, for a vision of healing in a place of natural beauty, for the right to determine my own future rather than have it stolen by someone who saw me as nothing more than an asset to be acquired and managed. The drive back to Helena was quieter than the journey out, each of us processing what we'd discovered. The additional evidence would strengthen the case against Richard, but it also confirmed the depth of his deception and the scale of what he'd planned to take from me. "We'll get it back," James said simply as we approached the safe house. "All of it." I nodded, too exhausted for more discussion, but comforted by his certainty. The visit to Riverstone had drained me physically, but strengthened my resolve. For the first time since waking from the coma, I felt fully connected to my purpose again, reminded viscerally of why Riverstone mattered. That night, settled back in the safe house surrounded by the protective presence of people I truly trusted, I slept more soundly than I had in months. The path ahead remained challenging: legal battles, physical recovery, rebuilding what had been damaged or lost. But the foundation remained solid. Like the mountains that watched over Riverstone, I would endure. The evidence discovered at the Yagi cabin proved crucial in the weeks that followed. The detailed development plans directly contradicted Richard's public statements about acting in my best interests and strengthened the prosecution's case substantially. Sarah reported that his attorney had reached out about potential plea negotiations, a sign that the Blackwoods were finally recognizing the strength of the evidence against them. They're starting to realize they can't just make this go away. With money and connections, she explained during one of our strategy sessions. The prosecutor is holding firm on the major fraud charges, but there might be room to negotiate on some of the lesser counts if Richard agrees to relinquish all claims to Riverstone and facilitate recovery of the sold parcels. What about the money he diverted? I asked, studying the latest financial analysis Sarah had provided. The forensic accountants had traced most of the funds Richard had taken from my accounts, but significant sums remained unaccounted for. That's still a sticking point, Sarah admitted. He claims some of it went to legitimate medical expenses and property maintenance, but the numbers don't add up. We're pushing for full restitution. My recovery continued to progress in parallel with the legal proceedings. 3 months after waking from the coma, my physical therapy had advanced to include daily walks of increasing distance and simple strength training. My cognitive function showed steady improvement, though processing complex information still required more effort and concentration than before the accident. Dr. Levine, the neurologist overseeing my recovery, was cautiously optimistic. During her monthly evaluation at the safe house, "The brain is remarkably adaptable," she explained, reviewing my latest test results. "You're demonstrating excellent improvement in executive function and memory consolidation. There may be some permanent changes to how you process certain types of information, but you're developing effective compensatory strategies." Translated from medical terminology, I was learning to work around the damage. My thinking might never be exactly the same as before, but I could still function effectively, still make decisions, manage my affairs, and pursue my goals. The assessment provided additional documentation of my competence, further undermining Richard's claim that he had acted due to my diminished capacity. 4 months after Richard's arrest, we received unexpected news that shifted the dynamics of our case. Thomas Blackwood, facing his own charges as an accomplice, had decided to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a more lenient sentence. "He's providing detailed testimony about the planning that went into targeting your property," Sarah reported, barely containing her satisfaction. According to Thomas, Richard identified Riverstone as a potential acquisition more than a year before you even met. The Blackwoods had been trying to assemble land for the Wilderness Estates development, and your parcel was crucial for their plans. "So our entire relationship was a setup from the beginning," I said, the confirmation somehow less painful than I might have expected. The emotional connection to Richard had been severed so completely that this final betrayal felt almost academic. Essentially, yes, Thomas claims the original plan was for Richard to convince you to sell or partner with them legitimately, but when you remained firm about your vision for the veterans' retreat, they moved to what Thomas called Plan B. Marriage followed, by gradual assumption of control. The revelation should have devastated me, but instead it brought a strange sense of clarity. My instincts had been correct from the beginning. The warning signs I'd dismissed as minor concerns or cultural differences had been genuine red flags. The Blackwoods had never seen me as a person, only as an obstacle to acquiring valuable real estate. "Did Thomas say anything about Victoria's involvement?" I asked, remembering Richard's mother and her thinly veiled condescension. Sarah nodded, grimly. According to his testimony, Victoria was not just aware but actively involved in planning. She specifically encouraged Richard to use the family heirloom for the engagement ring. Apparently, it's been used before in similar situations where they needed to secure a relationship quickly. The pattern of predatory behavior extending through the family explained so much about the dynamics I'd observed. The carefully orchestrated welcome into their circle, the subtle undermining of my confidence, the constant push to adapt to their values and expectations, all of it designed to make me malleable and ultimately expendable once they had what they wanted. With Thomas's cooperation, the legal machinery accelerated. Richard's attorneys made increasingly desperate attempts to suppress evidence or dismiss charges, but the combination of the fraudulent power of attorney, the cabin documents, the financial trail, and now his brother's testimony created an overwhelming case. 6 months after his arrest, Richard agreed to a plea deal that included substantial prison time, full financial restitution, and legally binding recognition that he had no claim to any of my assets. Most importantly for me, he agreed to facilitate the immediate return of the 2 Riverstone parcels he had sold, working with prosecutors to unwind the transactions without lengthy litigation. The day the paperwork was finalized, reinstating my full ownership of all 120 acres of Riverstone Ranch, Sarah arrived at the safe house with the documents and a bottle of champagne. "It's official," she announced, spreading the title papers on the kitchen table. "Riverstone is completely yours again, free and clear of any Blackwood claims." My father popped the champagne while my mother retrieved glasses. James and his security team, who had become like extended family during these months, joined us for the celebration. For the first time in what felt like forever, the focus wasn't on what had been lost or damaged, but on what could now be rebuilt. "To Riverstone," Sarah proposed, raising her glass. "And to the most stubborn combat medic I've ever had the privilege to know." "To Riverstone," everyone echoed. But I remained silent for a moment, overcome by the realization that this phase of the battle was truly ending. Richard would serve his sentence. The property was secure. My recovery was progressing. The path forward, while still challenging, was finally clear of the obstacles he had placed in my way. "To second chances," I said finally, raising my own glass. "And to everyone who helped make them possible." Later that evening, alone in my room at the safe house, I spread out the original architectural plans for the veterans' retreat. Many of the practical details would need updating. My physical condition had changed some of my perspectives on accessibility, and the timeline would require adjustment. But the core vision remained unchanged. Riverstone would become a place of healing, just as I had always intended. My phone chimed with a message from an unknown number. Cautious after everything that had happened, I showed it to James before opening it. "Eleanor, this is Victoria Blackwood," the message read. "I believe we should speak directly about putting this unfortunate situation behind us and moving forward in a way that benefits all parties." The audacity was breathtaking. Even now, with Richard convicted and the property restored, the Blackwoods were attempting to manipulate and control the narrative, to find some way to salvage their plans, or at least their reputation. "What do you want to do?" James asked after reading the message. I considered briefly, then deleted it without responding. Victoria Blackwood and her family had taken enough of my energy and attention. They would receive no more. "Nothing," I said, turning back to my plans for Riverstone. "They don't exist for me anymore." The next morning brought another milestone. Dr. Levine cleared me to return to Riverstone permanently if I wished, provided I maintained my therapy schedule and had appropriate support for my ongoing recovery. After months in the safe house, the prospect of returning to my own land, my own space, felt both liberating and slightly terrifying. "Are you sure you're ready?" my mother asked as I began sorting through the few possessions I'd accumulated during my stay in Helena. "The property has been empty for months. It needs work to be properly habitable." "I'm not talking about moving into the old cabin," I explained. "James has arranged for a temporary residence to be set up, one of those modular homes that can be adjusted for accessibility while we begin construction on the permanent facilities." The decision had been made during the previous weeks as the legal resolution came into focus. Rather than returning to Bozeman or staying in Helena, I would go directly to Riverstone and begin implementing the vision that had been interrupted, from property owner to resident and eventually to program director, rebuilding my life in parallel with rebuilding the retreat. Besides, I added, I won't be alone. Indeed, the support network that had formed during the crisis wasn't dissolving, with the legal resolution. James had agreed to remain as head of security for the property, bringing several of his team members who were interested in both the protection work and eventually participating in the therapeutic programs themselves. Sarah would continue handling legal matters related to the retreat's establishment, and several of my former military colleagues had volunteered to help with the initial setup. 1 week later, a small convoy of vehicles made its way along the now familiar route to Riverstone. Unlike the tense, security-focused visit months earlier, this journey felt like a homecoming, still careful, still mindful of potential threats, but fundamentally different in purpose and emotion. The temporary residence had been set up in a meadow near the planned lodge site, a modern, accessible structure that would serve as both living quarters and project headquarters during the construction phase. Solar panels and a propane system provided independent utilities, and a satellite connection ensured communication with the outside world. As I stepped from the vehicle, leaning less heavily on my cane than I had during our previous visit, the sensation of homecoming intensified. The mountains stood as they always had, indifferent to human dramas but somehow reassuring in their permanence. The creek continued its journey downward, the sound a constant reminder of nature's resilience. And the land itself, my land, truly mine again, waited patiently for its purpose to be fulfilled. "Welcome home, Ellie," my father said simply, understanding as he always did exactly what the moment meant. Home. Not just a place, but a purpose. Not just ownership, but stewardship. Not just recovery, but renewal. I took a deep breath of mountain air and felt something long constricted in my chest finally release. The road ahead would not be easy. Physical challenges, financial hurdles, logistical complexities all waited to be addressed. But for the first time since before the accident, I stood exactly where I was meant to be, surrounded by people who supported my vision rather than seeking to subvert it. "Let's get started," I said, turning toward the temporary headquarters where initial construction plans were already laid out. "We've got a retreat to build." The following year unfolded in a rhythm of progress and setbacks, each day bringing Riverstone closer to the vision I had held through the darkest moments of my recovery. Spring arrived in the Montana mountains with a vibrant intensity. Wildflowers erupting across meadows, creeks swollen with snowmelt, wildlife emerging from winter dens. The natural cycles of renewal seemed to mirror my own journey, offering daily reminders of resilience. Living on the property during construction presented unique challenges. The modular home served its purpose for basic shelter, but Montana winters demanded respect. We'd experienced pipes freezing during a particularly brutal cold snap in February, and the mountain roads sometimes became impassable after heavy snows. Yet these hardships somehow strengthened my connection to the land. Understanding its moods and demands was essential to creating a retreat that would work in harmony with this environment rather than against it. My physical recovery continued steadily, if not miraculously. The titanium rods in my leg would remain for life, and certain movements would always bring reminders of the accident. The traumatic brain injury left subtler but equally permanent changes. Occasional word-finding difficulties during stress, struggles with certain types of complex planning, fatigue that descended abruptly after periods of intense concentration. But the adaptations became second nature. I learned to schedule certain tasks for morning hours when my mind was clearest, to use specialized planning software that compensated for my organizational challenges, to recognize the warning signs of cognitive fatigue before it overwhelmed me. What had initially seemed like devastating limitations gradually transformed into workable differences in how I navigated the world. The groundbreaking ceremony for the main lodge occurred almost exactly 1 year after Richard's arrest. We kept it small and meaningful rather than elaborate, a gathering of those who had supported me through the crisis and those who would help shape Riverstone's future. Several veterans who had expressed interest in the future programs came to see the property and offer input on the developing plans. Captain Reynolds, Sarah, had taken leave from her JAG duties to attend, her formal uniform replaced by hiking, boots and practical layers for the mountain spring weather. She surveyed the construction site with obvious pride. "When you contacted me from that hospital room," she remarked as we walked the staked outline of the future lodge, "I never imagined we'd be standing here a year later. I thought best case scenario we'd recover some of your assets and get Richard charged with fraud." "I was just hoping to save enough of Riverstone to keep the dream alive," I admitted. Getting everything back and seeing him face real consequences seemed almost impossible then. Sarah nodded, understanding the distance we'd traveled. The judge's sentencing statement was something for the books. 18 years is substantial for white-collar crime. The severity of Richard's sentence had surprised even the prosecution. The judge, a Vietnam veteran himself, had delivered a scathing condemnation during sentencing, calling Richard's actions a particularly despicable betrayal of both marital trust and the sacrifice of those who serve our country. Victoria and the remaining Blackwood associates had withdrawn from public life in Montana after the scandal, relocating to their properties in California, according to local gossip. Thomas had received a significantly reduced sentence for his cooperation, 3 years with possibility of parole after 18 months. His testimony had been crucial in dismantling the Blackwoods' carefully constructed facade and exposing the pattern of predatory behavior that extended throughout the family's business dealings. "Any more contact from Victoria?" Sarah asked, seemingly reading my thoughts. "Not since I deleted her message," I replied. "I think they finally realized I'm not interested in their version of reconciliation." We continued our tour of the construction site, reviewing the progress with the project manager. The foundation for the main lodge was complete, with framing scheduled to begin the following week. The plans had evolved from my original vision, incorporating insights from my own recovery experience. "We've expanded the accessible design elements throughout," I explained, pointing to the blueprint modifications. "Every space is designed to accommodate different mobility challenges without feeling institutional. And we've created specialized areas for those dealing with sensory processing issues related to TBI. The traumatic brain injury community, military, and civilian had become an unexpected focus as I'd navigated my own recovery. The invisible nature of these injuries created unique challenges, often leaving survivors appearing outwardly normal while struggling with cognitive and emotional processing that others couldn't see or understand. Riverstone would address these needs alongside the more visible physical rehabilitation aspects of the program. Later that evening, as the construction crew departed and quiet settled over the property, I hosted a small dinner for the core group that had seen me through the past year. My parents, who divided their time between Arizona and a small apartment they'd purchased in Helena to be closer during my recovery. James, whose security firm had evolved to include specialized training for veterans transitioning to civilian employment. Sarah, whose legal expertise continued to guide Riverstone's development as an organization. Mariana, the nurse whose perceptiveness had been the first step in unraveling Richard's scheme, now completing advanced training in traumatic brain injury, care with plans to join the Riverstone staff once the facility opened. The conversation flowed easily among people who had become something more than friends through shared crisis and purpose. As the Montana sunset painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple, I found myself struck by a realization, something that had been gradually forming in my mind but suddenly crystallized into clarity. "I need to thank all of you," I said, during a natural lull in conversation. "Not just for your help during the worst time of my life, but for something more important. You helped me reclaim my story." They looked at me quizzically, waiting for clarification. "When I woke up from the coma," I continued, "I wasn't just physically broken. My entire narrative had been hijacked. Richard was controlling not just my assets, but how everyone perceived me, as the tragically injured wife whose decisions couldn't be trusted, whose dreams were impractical, whose value was only in what could be taken from her. I gestured toward the property stretching beyond the windows of our temporary home. Riverstone was never just about the land or the buildings. It was about creating a place where veterans could reclaim their own narratives after trauma, where they wouldn't be defined solely by injury or loss or what happened overseas. You didn't just help me get my property back. You helped me reclaim my own story and my right to determine its course. The understanding in their eyes told me they grasped exactly what I meant. For veterans, the struggle to define oneself beyond military experience and trauma was often as challenging as physical recovery. The narrative theft I'd experienced during my coma was an extreme version of what many service members faced when, returning to civilian life, other people defining their worth, capabilities, and futures through the limited lens of their service or injuries. That's what Riverstone truly needs to be, I concluded. Not just physical rehabilitation, but a place where people can reconnect with their own narratives and write the next chapters on their own terms. The concept resonated deeply with everyone present and became the guiding principle as construction continued through summer and into fall. The main lodge took shape against the mountain backdrop, its architectural elements reflecting both the natural landscape and practical accessibility. Separate cabins for program participants emerged along the creek, each designed to provide both community and privacy. By late autumn, with snow beginning to dust the highest peaks, the development of Riverstone had progressed enough to host a small pilot program, a weekend retreat for 5 veterans with traumatic brain injuries and their support persons. The buildings weren't fully completed, but the essential spaces were functional, and I felt an increasing urgency to begin the actual work rather than focusing solely on construction. The participants arrived on a crisp October morning. 3 men and 2 women representing different branches of service, different eras of conflict, different manifestations of brain injury. Their ages ranged from a 24-year-old Marine injured in an IED blast to a 65-year-old Vietnam veteran whose TBI had gone undiagnosed for decades. I greeted them at the temporary welcome center, acutely aware of the significance of this moment. After everything, the accident, the coma, Richard's betrayal, the legal battles, the grueling recovery, Riverstone was finally serving its intended purpose. The stolen dream had been reclaimed, restored, and was now becoming reality. "Welcome to Riverstone," I said simply, leaning on my cane as I had learned to do without shame or self-consciousness. "I'm Eleanor Blackwood, Ellie, and like each of you, I'm navigating life after traumatic brain injury." I deliberately used my married name despite everything associated with it. The Blackwood name had been tarnished in Montana business circles by Richard's actions, and I had considered returning to Martinez legally. But ultimately, I decided to retain the name while completely redefining what it meant in this community. Eleanor Blackwood would no longer be associated with Richard's crimes, but with Riverstone's healing work. "This weekend is just the beginning," I continued, looking at each participant in turn. "We're still building, still learning, still figuring out how to create the most effective environment for recovery and growth. You're not just our first guests, you're our partners in shaping what Riverstone will become." Over the next 3 days, we tested program elements ranging from adaptive, outdoor activities to cognitive rehabilitation techniques to trauma-informed mindfulness practices. The participants provided invaluable feedback from their lived experience, identifying what worked, what needed refinement, and what was missing entirely from our approach. On the final evening, gathered around a fire pit under a canopy of stars, one of the participants, a former Army sergeant named Miguel who'd sustained his TBI during a training accident, expressed what seemed to be a common sentiment. "This place feels different," he said, gesturing to the mountains surrounding us. "Most rehab programs treat us like we're broken and need fixing. Here, it feels like we're just people figuring out a new way forward." His words confirmed that the core philosophy was translating into actual experience. Riverstone wasn't about fixing anyone, but about creating space for self-directed healing and redefinition after trauma. Exactly what I had needed during my own recovery. As the pilot, group departed the following morning, with plans for a more extended program in the spring once construction was fully completed. I stood at the property entrance watching their vehicles descend toward the valley. The mountains stood as they always had, indifferent to human struggles, yet somehow offering perspective on them. The buildings we'd constructed seemed small against that backdrop, humble in their ambition, but meaningful in their purpose. Richard had seen this land only for its development potential, the profit to be extracted, the luxury homes to be sold, the status to be claimed. He had never understood that Riverstone's true value lay in what it could offer those who needed healing, connection, and renewed purpose after serving their country. In the end, his schemes had failed not just because of legal intervention, but because they were fundamentally misaligned with the land itself. Riverstone had always been meant for healing. Perhaps that's why, despite everything the Blackwoods had done to claim it, the property had found its way back to its intended purpose. I turned back toward the main lodge, where James and the staff were already debriefing about the pilot program and planning improvements. My leg ached from the weekend's activities, and cognitive fatigue pressed at the edges of my awareness after the intense social interaction. But these were familiar companions now, not enemies to be vanquished, but aspects of a new reality to be accommodated. The mountains would endure regardless of human plans. The veterans would continue to need spaces for healing and redefinition. And I would continue building what I had envisioned before Richard entered my life, before the accident, before the coma. A place where broken narratives could be reclaimed and rewritten by those who lived them. Not despite what had happened, but because of it. Each challenge had refined the vision. Each setback had clarified the purpose. Each betrayal had illuminated the importance of creating spaces defined by trust and authentic support rather than exploitation. Riverstone had survived the Blackwoods' attempt to claim it, and so had I. 3 years after waking from the coma, Riverstone Veterans Retreat officially opened at full capacity. The completed facility stood as a testament to perseverance, not just mine, but that of everyone who had contributed to bringing this vision to life despite extraordinary obstacles. The main lodge, constructed of local stone and timber, anchored the property with its wheelchair-accessible design disguised within beautiful architecture. 6 cabins nestled along the creek provided private accommodations for program participants. The Equine Therapy Center occupied the eastern meadow that Richard had sold and we had reclaimed. The hot springs on the northern parcel had been developed into therapeutic pools with varying temperatures and accessibility features. Most significantly, every aspect of Riverstone had been designed or refined with direct input from veterans themselves. Each building, path, and program element reflected their lived experiences and needs, rather than assumptions about what recovery should look like. The grand opening drew unexpected attention from both veterans advocacy organizations and national media. What had begun as a personal dream had evolved into something larger, a model for veterans rehabilitation that emphasized agency, dignity, and whole-person healing. As I stood at the podium during the opening ceremony, looking out at the gathered crowd of supporters, staff, and the first full cohort of program participants, I felt a complex mix of emotions: pride in what we had accomplished, gratitude for those who had made it possible, and a strange sort of gratitude even for the challenges that had shaped Riverstone into something stronger and more authentic than my original vision. Riverstone exists because of resilience, I began, leaning slightly on my cane, no longer a necessity for physical support most days, but a visual reminder of the journey that had brought us here. Not just my own, but the resilience of everyone who believed this place could and should exist. I acknowledged the key people who had stood by me through the darkest times, Sarah Reynolds, who had recently retired from the JAG Corps to become Riverstone's full-time legal director. James Corrado, whose security firm now operated from the property, providing both protection and vocational training for veterans interested in civilian security careers. Mariana Vasquez, who had completed her advanced certification in TBI care and now led our medical team. My parents, who had relocated permanently to Montana to be part of the Riverstone community. What we've built here isn't just buildings, I continued. It's a philosophy. A belief that recovery happens best when we reclaim authorship of our own stories, when we define ourselves rather than allowing others to define us by our injuries or experiences. The concept of narrative reclamation had become central to Riverstone's approach. The understanding that trauma, especially the complex trauma experienced by many veterans, often disrupted one's sense of continuous identity and personal agency. Our programs were designed not just to address physical and cognitive rehabilitation, but to help participants reconnect with their core values and capabilities, while integrating their military experiences into a larger life story they controlled. After the ceremony, as staff conducted tours and demonstrations of the various program elements, I found myself drawn to the meditation path that wound through the pine forest. This trail, designed to be accessible for various mobility levels, had become my personal sanctuary during the intense work of establishing Riverstone. Today, it offered a brief respite from the social demands of the opening events. The path led to a small clearing overlooking the valley, where a simple stone bench provided a place for contemplation. I sat there, absorbing the view of mountains that had witnessed the entire arc of this journey, from my initial purchase of Riverstone, through Richard's betrayal, to this moment of fulfillment. "Thought I might find you here," came Sarah's voice as she approached the clearing. "You always disappear to high ground when things get crowded." The former JAG officer had become one of my closest friends through our shared ordeal, her legal precision balanced by a dry humor that had sustained us through the most difficult moments. "Old combat medic habit," I replied with a smile. "Always assess from elevation when possible." She settled beside me on the bench, both of us silently appreciating the view for several minutes before she spoke again. "I have some news," she said. Finally. "Wasn't sure if today was the right time, but you should know. Thomas Blackwood was released on parole last week." I nodded, having expected this development. Thomas had served just over 2 years of his 3-year sentence, with early release granted for cooperation and good behavior. Has he made any statements? Nothing public. His attorney says he plans to relocate to Seattle, away from any remaining Blackwood business interests in Montana. Apparently, the family relationships fractured pretty thoroughly after everything came to light. The information produced no emotional reaction, which itself was noteworthy. 3 years ago, any mention of the Blackwoods had triggered immediate anxiety and anger. Now they existed at such a distance from my life that news about them felt almost academic. "And Richard?" I asked, more out of curiosity than concern. "Still serving his sentence. No chance of parole for at least another decade." Sarah hesitated, then added, "He filed another appeal last month. Denied, like the previous 3. I nodded, unsurprised. Richard had consistently refused to accept responsibility for his actions, maintaining to the end that he had been acting in my best interests given my medical condition. His inability to recognize my autonomy, to see me as a full person rather than an obstacle to his ambitions or a resource to be managed, had defined our relationship from the beginning, though I had been too blinded by his charm to recognize it. "It's strange," I said after a moment. "We're sitting on property he was willing to destroy a marriage and risk prison to obtain, and I barely think about him anymore." Sarah smiled slightly. "That's probably the best revenge, building something meaningful while he's completely irrelevant. To it." She was right. Richard had become increasingly peripheral to Riverstone's story and my own. His actions had shaped certain chapters, to be sure, but he was no longer a driving force in the narrative. The property he had coveted so desperately was now doing exactly what I had always intended, providing healing for those who had served their country, and his family's grand development plans had been permanently foreclosed. We returned to the main lodge as the afternoon's demonstrations were concluding. The first full cohort of program participants, 24 veterans with various physical and cognitive injuries, were settling into their accommodations, preparing for the 6-week intensive rehabilitation program that would begin formally the following day. During dinner in the community dining hall, I circulated among the tables, connecting with each participant briefly. Their stories represented the full spectrum of military experience and injury, from recent Afghanistan and Iraq deployments to Vietnam-era service, from visible physical wounds to the invisible injuries of TBI and PTSD. A Marine lieutenant named Karina Rodriguez, barely 30 with the hyper-vigilant eyes I recognized from my own mirror, spoke about her expectations for the program. "My doctors kept telling me what I couldn't do anymore," she said, the frustration evident in her voice. What limitations I needed to accept. Nobody talked about what might still be possible. Her words resonated deeply with my own experience. After waking from the coma, I had been defined primarily by what had been lost: cognitive function, physical capabilities, independence. Richard had leveraged these deficits to attempt taking everything else. It wasn't until I connected with people who saw beyond the limitations that recovery truly began. "That's exactly why Riverstone exists," I told her. "Not to ignore limitations, but to find the possibilities that exist alongside them. To write the next chapter, rather than getting stuck in the one where everything changed." Later that night, after the participants had retired to their cabins and the staff had completed their final preparations for the program's official start, I found myself alone in my office in the administrative wing of the main lodge. The space reflected my adapted work style: specialized organizational systems, voice recognition software for days when typing was challenging, a comfortable recliner for managing fatigue while continuing to work. On the wall hung a shadow box containing my Silver Star and Combat Medic badge alongside the medical scrubs I'd worn as a trauma nurse before the accident. These tangible reminders of previous chapters in my story provided context for the current one, not defining me completely, but acknowledging the experiences that had shaped my path to this moment. I opened my laptop to review the final program, schedule for the coming weeks, my mind already shifting from today's ceremonial opening to the real work ahead. A notification appeared on my screen, an email from an unfamiliar address with the subject line, "Gratitude and Apology." Cautious after everything I had experienced, I reviewed the sender information before opening it. The email came from Thomas. "Blackwood." "Eleanor," it began simply. "I've composed this message 100 times in my mind during the past 2 years. Now that I'm released, I finally have the opportunity to send it. First, congratulations on the opening of Riverstone Retreat. The news coverage showed what you've accomplished, and it's more meaningful than anything we would have created with that land." The message continued with a detailed apology for his role in Richard's scheme, acknowledging the harm caused without making excuses. He explained that his time in prison had forced a complete reassessment of the values and behaviors he had accepted as normal within the Blackwood family. "I know you have no reason to believe my sincerity or to offer forgiveness," he concluded. "I'm not asking for either. I simply wanted you to know that your resilience has inspired reflection and change beyond the scope you might have imagined. The Blackwood name caused you immense harm, which I deeply regret. But your example is helping at least one Blackwood find a better path forward." I sat with the message for several minutes, surprised not by its existence, but by my response to it. There was no surge of anger, no reopening of old wounds, just a quiet acknowledgement that healing takes many forms and follows unpredictable paths. I chose not to respond immediately, saving the email to consider further when I wasn't entering such an important phase of Riverstone's development. Thomas's journey toward accountability was his own, not something that required my participation or validation. Instead, I returned to the program schedules, making final adjustments based on the day's observations of our first full participant cohort. Tomorrow would mark the true beginning of Riverstone's mission, the shift from construction and preparation to active healing work. As I completed my final tasks for the evening, I was struck by how thoroughly my life had transformed from that moment in the hospital when I'd first discovered Richard's betrayal. The journey from trauma to recovery, from victimization to reclaimed agency, from stolen dream to manifested vision, it formed a narrative arc I couldn't have imagined during those dark early days. The property Richard had tried to steal had become not just a veteran's retreat, but a living testimony to resilience. The capabilities he had dismissed as compromised by my injuries had proven more than sufficient to undo his schemes and build something meaningful in their place. As I locked my office and prepared to return to my private quarters in the east wing of the lodge, I paused at the large windows overlooking the property. The cabins along the creek showed warm lights as their occupants settled in for the night. The mountains stood as dark silhouettes against a star-filled sky. The land itself seemed peaceful, as if finally fulfilling its purpose. Tomorrow, the real work would begin, helping other veterans reclaim their own narratives after trauma and loss. It was the work I had always intended to do, the purpose that had guided me through the darkest times. Richard had tried to rewrite my story during my coma, removing my name from properties and accounts, positioning himself as the decision-maker and authority. He had failed to understand that true ownership isn't about signatures on legal documents, but about connection to purpose and meaning. Riverstone had always been mine in the ways that mattered most. Now, finally, it would fulfill the promise I had seen in it from the beginning, becoming a place where broken narratives could be reclaimed and new chapters written by those who had earned that right through their service and sacrifice, including me. 5 years after Riverstone's official opening, I stood at the edge of the newly completed amphitheater overlooking the valley, watching as staff made final preparations for the evening's celebration. The open-air structure, built into a natural depression in the terrain, provided accessible seating with spectacular mountain views. Tonight it would host our 5-year anniversary gala, a milestone I had sometimes doubted we would reach. The journey had not been without challenges. Funding fluctuated with economic tides and changing political priorities for veterans programs. Staff turnover brought periods of instability as we searched for people who understood both the technical aspects of rehabilitation and the philosophical approach that made Riverstone unique. My own health presented occasional setbacks when TBI symptoms flared during times of stress, or when I pushed beyond my body's recalibrated limits. Yet for each challenge, unexpected support had emerged. A network of dedicated donors now provided sustainable funding. Our staff had stabilized with a core team deeply committed to our mission. My own health management had evolved from constant struggle to mindful navigation, not absence of limitations, but skillful partnership with them. Most importantly, Riverstone's impact had grown beyond anything I had envisioned in those early planning days before the accident. What began as a modest therapeutic retreat now served as a nationally recognized model for veteran rehabilitation, hosting not only direct service programs, but also professional training, research partnerships, and policy advocacy. The Senator's Wine. Motorcade just passed the main gate, James reported, approaching with the quiet efficiency that had made him invaluable as both security director and operations manager. ETA 10 minutes. Media team is already in position. I nodded, mentally shifting into the public-facing role that still didn't come naturally to me despite years of practice. Senator Diana Coburn, a decorated Navy veteran herself, had been instrumental in securing federal support for Riverstone's expanded programs. Her visit for our anniversary celebration would bring welcome attention to veteran rehabilitation needs beyond our specific facility. Butterflies? Sarah asked, joining us at the Amphitheater Overlook. After 5 years as Riverstone's legal director, she had recently accepted a dual appointment with the Veterans Justice Project while maintaining her role with us part-time. Her legal acumen had been crucial not only in establishing Riverstone's foundation, but in advocating for broader policy changes benefiting disabled veterans nationwide. Always, I admitted with a smile. Public speaking wasn't covered in combat medic training. Just treat it like triage, she suggested, falling into our familiar pattern of military-inflected humor. Most urgent information first, maintain direct pressure on key points, and don't sugarcoat the prognosis. The reference to our shared military past eased the pre-event tension as intended. So much had changed in the years since we'd first connected during my hospital awakening. But the foundation of trust and mutual understanding remained unaltered, perhaps the most valuable constant in my transformed life. As we walked back toward the main lodge where the official reception would begin, I was struck by how thoroughly Riverstone had evolved from concept to living community. Nearly 40 full-time staff now supported our programs, alongside dozens of part-time specialists and volunteers. Many were veterans themselves, including several who had first come to Riverstone as participants in our rehabilitation programs. The property had expanded as well. 3 years ago, we had purchased an adjacent 80-acre parcel when it unexpectedly came on the market, allowing us to develop additional residential facilities and extend our therapeutic trail system. The original 120 acres I had fought so hard to reclaim from Richard now formed the core of a 200-acre campus dedicated to healing and renewal. My personal living quarters remained in the east wing of the main lodge, modified over time to better accommodate both my physical needs and my role as executive director. I had declined several opportunities to purchase separate housing in nearby communities, preferring to remain fully immersed in the Riverstone environment. This was home in every sense that mattered, not just a workplace or a residence, but the physical embodiment of purpose and belonging. The reception began with the expected formalities: welcomes, introductions, acknowledgments of key supporters. Senator Coburn arrived with minimal fanfare despite her position, her military bearing evident in her posture and direct gaze. We had met several times previously during her committee work on Veterans Affairs, developing a professional respect based on shared commitment to improving rehabilitation services. Director Blackwood, she greeted me with a firm handshake. Congratulations on 5 remarkable years. Riverstone has become exactly the kind of model program we need to see replicated nationwide. Thank you, Senator. Though I hope you'll call me Ellie during your visit. We try to maintain a certain informality here, despite the necessary organizational structure. She smiled with genuine warmth. Ellie it is then. And I'm Diana. Rank and titles tend to create unnecessary barriers in the work that matters most. As we moved through the reception, introducing the senator to staff, board members, and program participants, I was reminded yet again of how far Riverstone had come from its threatened beginning. The confident organization surrounding me bore little resemblance to the precarious dream Richard had nearly destroyed, yet its essence remained true to my original vision. Perhaps even truer now, shaped by the very adversity that might have derailed it. The formal dinner preceding the main ceremony provided an opportunity for more substantive discussions about Riverstone's future. Senator Coburn was particularly interested in our research partnerships with medical centers studying traumatic brain injury rehabilitation approaches. The longitudinal data you're gathering here could transform treatment protocols system-wide, she noted as we discussed preliminary findings. Particularly your focus on narrative reclamation as a measurable component of recovery. It's been the most consistently validated aspect of our approach, I confirmed. The medical interventions are critical, of course, but helping veterans reclaim authorship of their own stories creates a foundation that supports all other forms of recovery. As dinner concluded and guests began making their way to the amphitheater for the evening's main program, I excused myself for a few moments of quiet preparation. My office had become a sanctuary over the years, a space designed around my specific needs and workflows, filled with reminders of the journey that had brought me to this point. The shadow box containing my silver star hung alongside photographs, documenting Riverstone's evolution, groundbreaking ceremonies, program milestones, moments of connection with participants whose lives had intersected with ours. A special section held images of the core team who had stood by me through the darkest times: Sarah, James, Mariana, my parents. Family created by choice and circumstance rather than blood. A discreet knock preceded Mariana's entrance. My former nurse had become Riverstone's medical director, transforming the specialized knowledge she'd gained during my recovery into comprehensive programs for veterans with similar injuries. 5 minutes until you're needed at the amphitheater, she reminded me. How's the fatigue level? Need any adjustments before your speech? Her question reflected the deep understanding we'd developed about managing TBI symptoms in high-pressure situations. Cognitive fatigue remained my most persistent challenge, particularly during complex social events requiring sustained attention and executive function. I'm good, I assured her after a brief internal assessment. Paced myself through dinner, stayed hydrated, used the memory techniques for names. The speech is loaded in the prompter if I need it, but I think I can deliver most of it directly. Mariana nodded, professional satisfaction evident in her expression. You've come so far from those first days in the hospital. I wish some of my current patients could see what's possible with the right support and enough determination. They will, I replied, gathering my notes and tablet. That's exactly why we're doing this, showing what's possible beyond the limitations others try to impose. The amphitheater was filled to capacity as I took my place at the podium. Nearly 300 people had gathered for the celebration: staff, program participants past and present, supporters, community partners, and media representatives. The setting sun cast the mountains in dramatic relief, providing a backdrop that no event planner could have artificially created. 5 years ago, I began, deliberately echoing the opening of Riverstone's inaugural ceremony, we gathered to open a facility dedicated to serving those who had served our country. What we couldn't fully articulate then was that Riverstone would become more than a rehabilitation center. It would become a community of shared purpose, a laboratory for innovative approaches to recovery, and most importantly, a place where stories interrupted by trauma could find new chapters and meaningful continuations. As I continued with my prepared remarks, I found myself departing occasionally from the script to speak directly from experience. The formal language of organizational accomplishments and statistical outcomes felt less compelling than the human reality of what Riverstone represented, the tangible embodiment of resilience in the face of attempted erasure. Many of you know parts of my personal journey, I acknowledged. How a catastrophic accident led to a coma, during which my then-husband attempted to sell off my assets, including this property. What may be less obvious is how that experience shaped Riverstone's core philosophy. The recognition that trauma often involves the theft of narrative control, the loss of agency in one's own story. I paused, looking out at the gathered faces, some familiar with every detail of that ordeal, others hearing aspects of it for the first time. When I woke from that coma, I found myself written into someone else's story, cast as the tragically diminished wife whose dreams were impractical, whose judgment couldn't be trusted, whose value lay only in what could be extracted from her. The legal battle to reclaim my property was also a fight to reclaim my narrative, my right to define my own capabilities, priorities, and future. The personal disclosure felt appropriate in this moment of reflection, particularly with so many veterans present who had experienced their own forms of narrative disruption through injury, trauma, or the challenging transition to civilian life. That experience became Riverstone's foundation, not despite the trauma, but because of it. Every program, every building, every trail on this property reflects the understanding that healing requires reclaiming authorship of our own stories, not erasing the difficult chapters, but integrating them into a larger narrative we control. As I continued with more specific acknowledgments and future plans, I was struck by the journey that had brought me to this moment. The Eleanor Blackwood. Standing confidently before this gathering was almost unrecognizable from the injured, disoriented woman who had awakened in a hospital bed to discover her husband's betrayal. Yet they were the same person, the earlier experiences providing essential context for the present, rather than defining limitations. The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of plans for Riverstone's next expansion phase, a specialized research and training center focused on traumatic brain injury rehabilitation, to be named in honor of my parents, who had provided unwavering support throughout the journey. Their tearful reaction as the rendering was displayed on the large screen brought a rare moment of public emotion from me as well. As the formal program transitioned to a musical performance featuring several veteran musicians who had participated in Riverstone's programs, I found a quiet moment at the edge of the amphitheater. The property stretched before me, bathed in the soft glow of evening lights from trails, buildings, and the therapeutic gardens that had been among our earliest completed features. James joined me silently, his presence comfortable after years of working closely together. We stood watching the celebration unfold, both of us more comfortable observing than participating in large social gatherings despite our leadership roles. "Heard anything from Thomas recently?" he asked after several minutes. One of the few people who knew I had eventually responded to Thomas Blackwood's email with a brief but civil acknowledgement. "Occasionally," I replied. "He's working with a restorative justice program in Washington state. Seems to be finding his own path forward." The contact remained minimal. A few exchanged messages over the years, primarily focused on his efforts to make amends through work with organizations supporting vulnerable individuals. I had neither sought nor offered forgiveness, but had recognized his attempts at accountability as genuine. "And the other Blackwoods?" I shook my head. "Nothing direct. Victoria died last year according to public records. Richard continues serving his sentence and filing unsuccessful appeals. Their story isn't part of mine anymore, except as background context." It was true. The people who had once dominated my consciousness through their betrayal and manipulation had receded to peripheral characters in a history that felt increasingly distant. The Blackwood name I still carried had been thoroughly redefined through Riverstone's work, its association with luxury development schemes replaced by connection to healing and community service. As the evening progressed and formal events concluded, I found myself making a final walk along the meditation trail before retiring. The path was illuminated with subtle solar lighting, making it safely navigable even at night, while preserving the peaceful darkness of the mountain setting. Near the trail's highest point, I paused at the stone bench that had become my personal thinking spot over the years. From this elevation, the entire Riverstone campus was visible. The main lodge with its warm lights, the participant cabins along the creek, the equine therapy facilities, the new amphitheater, and the undeveloped areas still maintained as natural habitat. 10 years had passed since my accident, 8 since waking from the coma to discover Richard's betrayal, 7 since the confrontation in my hospital room that had revealed his scheme and begun the process of reclaiming what he had attempted to steal. The journey from that moment to this one had been neither linear nor easy. There had been setbacks. In my physical recovery, challenges in establishing Riverstone, moments of doubt about whether the vision could be realized. Yet each obstacle had ultimately refined and strengthened the core purpose rather than derailing it. Richard had seen Riverstone only as valuable real estate to be exploited, land to be subdivided and sold as luxury properties for personal profit. He had never understood that its true value lay in its capacity to facilitate healing, to provide space for reconnection with purpose and meaning after trauma. The profound irony was that his attempt to steal this place had ultimately made it stronger, more resilient, more authentically aligned with its purpose than it might otherwise have been. The traumatic interruption of my original plans had forced deeper consideration of what matters most in recovery. the reclamation of personal narrative and agency that became Riverstone's philosophical foundation. As I made my way back toward the main lodge, I reflected on the strange gratitude I sometimes felt for that difficult chapter of my life. Not gratitude for the betrayal or the suffering, but for the clarity and purpose that emerged from them, the deeper understanding of what healing truly requires, and the community of authentic support that formed in response to crisis. Riverstone had survived attempted theft, just as I had survived traumatic injury and betrayal. Both of us had emerged not just intact but transformed, our essential purpose clarified through trial. The dream Richard had tried to steal now helped hundreds of veterans each year reclaim their own interrupted narratives and discover new chapters. Beyond trauma. In the final analysis, that was the most complete victory imaginable. Not just recovering what was nearly lost, but transforming it into something more meaningful than what had initially been envisioned. Not despite the trauma, but through it and beyond it, to a purpose that would have remained undiscovered without the journey through darkness. If you've stayed with Eleanor's story this long, you know it's more than just a tale of betrayal and recovery. It's about reclaiming your power when others try to write your story for you. Every day, people face versions of what Eleanor experienced. Times when illness, injury, or crisis make them vulnerable to those who see opportunity rather than responsibility in their suffering. Her journey from combat medic to coma patient to the founder of a healing community shows that our greatest setbacks can become the foundation for our most meaningful contributions. It's a reminder that the true value of what we build lies not in property or assets, but in purpose and impact. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel. We share stories of resilience, justice, and transformation that remind us of our capacity to rebuild after betrayal and loss. Your subscription helps us continue bringing these narratives to light and creating a community around the shared belief that our stories belong to us, and no one can take them away without our permission. Thank you for listening to Eleanor's journey. Until next time, remember, reclaim your story, rebuild on your terms, and recognize that the most meaningful victories often come after our greatest challenges.